before we start today's episode, just wanted to let you know that Joel and I use a little bit of explicit language in this episode while we're discussing, some of the recent FCC proposals. So if you have small children listening with you, maybe you want to put some earbuds on or possibly maybe give them some noise-canceling headphones. Just want to let you know. Hey, this is Dennis, and welcome to another episode of the Grounded Reason podcast, where Joel and I talk about things like streaming media, cord cutting, internet technology, and how to use those things just to make life better. In general, it does.
It really does.
It really does. So I've been getting some questions over email about net neutrality, and while we've gone over what it is, why it's important, we haven't really put it all together in one episode. Yeah. We've kind of talked about it in several episodes. We've explained what it is. And really what's happening is people are writing in, people have actually written their congressmen based off of our suggestions.
Oh.
And their representatives.
I'm as surprised as the rest of you out there.
And they've actually explained, okay, so a certain sect of representatives, there are really only two sects of representatives, so we can figure out who I'm talking about based on this. They'll send them, information about their privacy or or net neutrality, and ask them, why have you done this? And it's based off stuff that we've told them on the show. And the senator always comes back and I swear they're in lockstep with the talking points, because everyone I've seen, it's like, well, Obama seized control of the internet.
Yeah. That was not a thing.
No, that didn't.
We went over this in another. I'm sorry, Dennis. Sorry, I need to take a moment. You go ahead.
But I know. But I'm kind of, that's very condensed because these are long emails. But really, they're kind of saying that when the FCC declared the ISP as a utility, that was some kind of outlandish kind of power grab. Yeah. And that's ridiculous.
And it's absolutely absurd.
It is. And today's episode's really going to say why that's ridiculous, because I'm going to go, sorry, Joel. We are going to go.
And the broader community, we all
of us are going to go
We shall go there together, people.
And we're going to look at the history of net neutrality, communication, and why we are where we are right now.
Which is not in a great place.
No, it really, really isn't. So, that's going to be today's episode, considering that, Chairman Pai last week gave his big speech pretty much saying we're going to roll back net neutrality. I think today's a good time to explain exactly what it means and what's on the line, where it came from, and why Chairman Pai's ideas are pretty insane.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
Well, before we get into it, I wanted to try a little experiment with our listeners. Because usually, if you look in iTunes and if you look in the technology rankings, we creep into those rankings every once in a while. We're somewhere usually between 200 and 150. And I have a theory that it's based on how many people subscribe. So as a test on this episode, if you haven't subscribed the Grounded Reason podcast and you're listening on iTunes, hit the subscribe button and subscribe. You can unsubscribe later, but I am just curious to see if this theory is correct.
It would be great to get a little blip out of it.
And if I could see how far we climb in the rankings and in the technology rankings, technology category on iTunes, and if it gets a boost on Monday, then we'll know that's how they're ranking folk. Because there's a big debate out there. People are saying it's because of reviews, it's because of, searches, or it's because of subscriptions. So this will kind of figure it out. But I have to trust our listeners out there who, don't really subscribe to a lot of podcasts and just kind of check in, on Mondays or Tuesdays. Right. Just hit the subscribe. Just see what happens.
Won't hurt anything. Come on,
you can unsubscribe.
We're not holding you
to it. We're not holding you to it.
Yeah,
it'd be nice if you stayed on, but
we like you.
And now, since I've plugged us early, I don't have to do us later.
There we go.
There you go. So, okay. So let's get into this. As I said, Pi gave a speech last week. He said that, that's kind of opening up the floodgates to comment, because while we're recording, he hasn't posted
his official statement
hasn't yet. Right. Exactly. But I'm sure by the time this airs, it will.
Yeah.
When it does, I will put in the show notes and how to comment, so you can go and scream at Chairman Pi.
When it does, I'm going to go have a large glass of bourbon.
But for new listeners, on the high level, net neutrality in the nutshell, as I said last week, is no throttling and no blocking of content that ISPs don't like, and no giving content they do like privilege over other content.
Yeah, can we back up 1 second with that? Just to make it a little more layperson for everyone.
Go ahead.
So, think of it as there are the ISPs, the obvious, right? Like the Verizons and
your Comcasts and your AT&T.
And then there are content providers, right?
Or edge providers is another term they use for them, right?
And so that's your Netflix, your Hulus, etc.
Your websites you go to.
Yeah.
Any application you use on the internet.
This podcast, everything. Right?
Yes. We are a information service on the internet.
Yep. For lack of a better term. So those are the two basic categories. And there's obviously bleed over between the two, because sometimes the ISPs have bought content providers. Like
or they have a search engine.
Or they have a search engine.
Right.
That's another example. Yeah.
Right.
So I guess the thing that I want to call out here is what net neutrality rules are really trying to avoid is the ISPs that see, let's say, a content provider or any source on the internet as competition or some sort of threat. Net neutrality prevents those ISPs from penalizing them in any sort of way.
Exactly.
Right? Like, so if, let's say, what is it? AT&T owns DirecTV, right? Is that correct?
That is, well, yes.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, they have DirecTV now.
Yeah. So if for whatever reason they did a study and they found out Netflix was eating their lunch, right? And everybody was abandoning DirecTV to go over to Netflix.
Right.
So theoretically, not theoretically, from a practical standpoint, if net neutrality rules were not in place, what AT&T could do is what's called throttling on anyone that used Netflix that went over AT&T's lines.
Which is a lot of people.
Right. And so that would make all of us go, well, Netflix stinks, right? Because the way just us as humans look at things is whatever I'm interacting with at the time is what I blame for the problem.
Right.
I don't, and maybe you listeners are more sophisticated than I am, but in general, I've found this to be the case with end users that, I'm sorry, I got really IT there.
We need end users?
When I said end users, I should say people, right?
Human beings.
Yeah, humans.
When humans use technology.
When humans use technology, whatever the immediate technology they are interacting with is what they blame for whatever problem they have. So AT&T, in this case, to pick on them, if they were to throttle Netflix, they would be betting on the fact that the rest of us would look at Netflix and be like, oh, that service sucks, and go back.
Exactly.
Or at least leave Netflix.
Right. And net neutrality was really to stop that from happening. Now, to go back where the concept came from, we're going to have to rewind ourselves about 150 years.
So it's like Peabody and Sherman.
Right.
We hop in our Wayback Machine.
And I mean, people are like, really? Net neutrality back in 1860? Yes. Yep. That's when it started with the telegraph.
Yeah.
Because at the time, there was concern that companies who own the telegraph lines would give preference to their telegrams.
It's exactly the same scenario.
Yeah. So rules were put in place. And it was actually called the U.S. Federal Pacific Telegraph Act of 1860. And in it, it says this: the messages received from any individual, company, or corporation, or from any telegraph lines connecting with this line at either end of the terminal, shall be impartially transmitted in order of their reception. It's really saying first come, first serve.
Yeah.
On the and you can't, you can't throttle, which would be delaying the telegram in favor of another telegram.
Yep.
Or
even if it's
block a telegram.
Yeah, and if you own the line, you can't say, hey, that competitor's telegram has to sit, so I can shove my information across the line.
Exactly.
And honestly, just from a historical perspective, like the 1860s was like I don't know if you would call it a golden era, but it's when like antitrust regulation really started to come into its own with like the Sherman Antitrust Act, this kind of stuff. And it was because large national services with the railroads and telegraph started to really happen. Prior to that, most everything was relatively small. Like economies were not national in scale for the most part.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess with the telegraph company, you'd have probably like Western Union back then.
That's my point.
That's it. Like, so it was necessary to,
And the same idea with the railroads. The only difference with the railroads is they are more similar to the ISPs in the sense that they are regional monopolies.
Well, I'm going to get to that in a bit because the railroads do come up in this.
Ooh.
In this history here, because, so like 2 decades after that, and that was really a good way to operate, the telegraph system in the United States. It kind of, it made it dependable and a good. I mean, at the time, that's like their internet.
Yeah.
In 1860s, being able
information
to communicate with somebody across the United States was unbelievable.
Amazing.
So 2 decades later, a guy you might have heard of him, Alexander Graham Bell.
It seems vaguely familiar.
He invented and patented the telephone. And he started American Bell, which eventually became something called American Telephone and Telegraph, which eventually, is now AT&T.
Which, honestly, very few people, I think myself included, know what AT&T actually stands for.
Yeah, that's what it stands for.
It's that old.
Yes.
It's been that powerful for that long.
Right. So that came about, and as other forms of communication came into use, the telephone and then like radio, Congress started passing specific laws based on that medium. And, they had the Radio Act of 1927, and for telephone, they had the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910. And it pretty much, in those acts, the same sort of net neutrality as we call it today applied, like the do not interfere with content or communication, just whatever priority it comes in, that's how you deliver it. In the 1930s, the U.S. government started to realize that the principles of electronic communication were pretty much fundamentally similar regardless of the medium of communication. And that's when in 1934, instead of they had all these laws, the ones I just mentioned, and they consolidated them into the Communications Act of 1934. That's also the law that formed the FCC.
Yep. And it's honestly, to me, it's a little amazing that they were able to be that perceptive, just in general, right? Like
they were.
The idea that the rules, if you wrote them correctly, would be generally the same regardless of the technology.
Yeah. And while that was the original kind of like idea, a lot of times when you have an idea, the implementation kind of doesn't really hold true to the strategy.
Well, and we'll get there with Title II, but
with the Telecommunications Act too, while they did consolidate a lot of the laws, they still, and a big problem with that original Telecommunications Act for a long time until they changed it in 1996, they put the laws and standards in based on the technology platform.
And honestly, it's very hard not to. Right? Like, but it reminds me of like Glass-Steagall, where
the separation between commercial banking and investment banking.
Yep.
Quick, just so we can explain, that was put in place after the Great Depression because banks were gone hog wild.
I think in 1934.
Right. After
just the year.
Oh, okay, gotcha. So, and basically they wanted to separate people saving money from banks taking that money and just investing it into risky investments so people would still have their savings, was the general idea of Glass-Steagall.
Well, and my point in bringing that up is it's one of those things that is, I think it was on the books for almost 80 years.
Yeah, it was overturned in the mid-90s.
Yeah. Well, okay, so 75 years. With almost no alterations at all, regardless of technology or technique. And that's amazing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, I can't think of very many things that can, stand that test of time.
In policy.
No.
So, in the Communications Act of 1934, they basically considered communications technology, all communications technology, as a public good. And the stated goal was to have broadcasting and telephone technologies regulated the same way. And the former, because it doesn't exist anymore, I think this actually dissolved in the mid-90s as well, was the Interstate Commerce Commission. You know how they used to regulate railways?
Yep.
That was actually
and
the example.
Trucking.
The example was how railways are regulated. That's how we want to regulate communication.
Yep.
And it's basically, if somebody's going to carry cargo, if a train's going to carry cargo, it can't, decide I'm going to take this cargo from this company, but not that cargo from that company. They have to do everything equally over the railways. Same thing was considered with communications.
Yep.
And in the Act, common carrier is actually defined, and it says, okay, it's the common carrier or carrier means any person engaged as a common carrier for hire in interstate or foreign communication by wire or radio, or in interstate or foreign radio transmission of energy, except where reference is made to common carriers not subject to this act. So basically, unless you've got a specific exemption in the act. This is important. It says, but a person engaged in radio broadcasting shall not, insofar as such a person is so engaged, be deemed a common carrier. That right there is a separation between the person on the radio, who is what you would consider an application,
and the tubes.
Exactly. It's the person providing the information, and it's the content and the carrier. It's the content, who is the broadcaster, and then the carrier, which is the wires that take his voice somewhere else.
See previous episode if you haven't heard Dennis and I on our soapbox about what should be the separation between the FCC and the FTC.
Right. And exactly. And and I'm just going through this history here because I just want to prove to people out there that there is a long tradition when it comes to separating the content from the carrier.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to the telegraph in this country. And it goes further. Common carrier is something that came out of English common law.
Right.
Like when people would just carry goods Like when you would carry ice from like, up north down south. Like that's where common carrier came from.
You're getting very Game of Thrones here.
Yeah, it goes back that far.
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
That's not real, right?
Yeah, it is. It's totally real.
Agree to disagree.
So, I mean, and the distinction between like the broadcaster and the medium they're broadcasting over, it's important when it comes to these two emergent technologies that came along later. One of them in the 60s and 70s, the U.S. government, they started developing packet switching networks. ARPANET is one you might have heard one because that became something called, I think it's called the Internet.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, okay. And in 1980, the Internet, it became open for public and commercial use. And eventually, in the mid 90s, it was completely given over to the public in total for use. Mm-hmm. So, that was one technology that was huge. The other one was cable TV. And in the late 60s and 70s, back then in like the late 60s and 70s, that was like, you had to have some bucks to have cable TV. Yeah. It was very like a privileged thing. And then it started.
And you had to live in a neighborhood that had bucks.
Yeah.
Because
right.
They were laying lines, and those lines weren't cheap, and they weren't doing it for a person.
Right.
They were doing it for a population.
Yes. So yeah, it's a very exclusive club in the 70s to get cable TV.
I didn't get cable as a child until the late 80s.
Well, what's funny is like I think we were into the 90s by the time we had cable as a kid. And before that, my dad was always finding like these one-offs. Like it was a company that would kind of just like, it was like 3 extra channels. Like there's something called like a VTV, and you get this box, and it's like these 3 weird like public access channels because he didn't want to pay for cable, so he found like this cheap thing that was trying to simulate cable, but not really.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, it's pretty terrible. So basically, cable TV came out, and actually, cable TV is really where we have that's really what causes the rift here. Because we're talking for over a century, for 100 years now, we've had this idea of common carrier and the idea of the wires or the medium carrying, and then the broadcaster being something separate, the person providing the content. But with cable TV, there was a big debate because, should the FCC regulate this as common carrier? Because they didn't really separate the wire from the content, because the wire was carrying only cable TV.
Until
they went into broadband. But I could totally see early on that
it makes some sense.
Right? I mean, if you're a policy person, and you figure back then, tech kind of permeates everything now.
It does.
To where,
but back in the day,
it didn't.
It used to be. Well, I mean, like this is the what is it? 2003 is the example people normally point to, where the way I've heard it phrased is like Steve Jobs, which means AKA Apple, right?
Right.
Like the iPhone changed everything in the sense that I was watching, content became device neutral, right? Like or device agnostic is the actual expression, right? Like I could surf the internet on my phone, I could listen to a podcast, I could listen to music, I could take a phone call, I could watch a television show, etc. But prior to that, everything was relatively stovepiped.
Mm-hmm.
So when you talked about television, you were watching it on a television.
Right.
There was not this thing where I go home and I watch something on my Kindle, or someone who makes more money than me watches it on their iPad.
Yeah.
So I can get why policy people design things this way. It just is unfortunate.
It is. Because what happened, and the way it was written, remember how I was talking about like the Communications Act and, the broadcaster, because it actually specifically says that a person engaged in radio broadcasting shall not, insofar as such a person is engaged, be deemed as common carrier. Well, in 1979, a lawsuit came up where the FCC wanted to force a cable company to provide basic television to about 4,000 households. And the courts ruled that because of that line, like the broadcasting line,
Right.
where, a person broadcasting isn't common carrier, the court deemed that cable TV is not a common carrier service because they did not delineate between the person broadcasting and the line that it's being broadcasted over. So in 1979, cable was pretty much separated from
Everything else.
being a common carrier at that point. But in 1979, cable TV was just cable TV.
Yeah. You literally could watch the paid television shows they pushed across that line.
There was no internet. There was no other way of communicating over that line. So you can see where this is going to cause a massive issue. Because in 1979, they had no view of... They couldn't predict the future. They had no idea internet was going to be delivered over broadband cable.
Yeah, like you said, it's from the court's perspective, they had to make a narrow decision. Like, that's how our courts are supposed to work. And it was reasonable to expect that, or for them to interpret the law the way they did, in that cable television would simply provide television, right? Rather than other unknown services that would potentially exist.
Yeah. So now you have an internet that's pretty much, let's go fast forward to the 90s. You have an internet that's pretty much accessed through phone lines at the time, dial-up and DSL. Those, common carrier, because they're going over communications lines. Well, cable TV, all of a sudden, which is not common carrier, develops broadband cable modems.
Yep.
So that caused a complete, shitstorm, for the lack of a better word, in the market.
Yeah.
And they really didn't know how to handle it. But since, cable TV was not common carrier, then I guess cable modems aren't either. And it was kind of just the de facto way things operated from, the late 90s on to about 2002.
Yep.
Which you had some immense lobbying.
Yeah.
Of, at the time, Michael Powell? Is his name Michael Powell?
Yeah,
okay,
Michael.
Yeah. It's Colin Powell's son.
Powell's son.
Right.
Yeah.
He was the chairman
of the FCC.
Of the FCC. And under some really hard lobbying, finally kind of settled this argument and just said that cable modem service is an information service, not common carrier.
Yep.
Which means it just provides information like I am to you right now over this podcast. And there is no telecommunications component to it.
Right. Which is when things start getting a little screwy.
Well, yeah, because...
Well, actually, let me back that up. It's when things get codified as screwy.
Yes, because it was screwy already, but you also have to keep in mind that DSL wasn't much faster than cable when it first came out.
Right, and it was also one of those things where things were a little weird because of the lack of common carrier distinction for cable broadband. Right. But it wasn't codified in policy.
Yeah, well, this also caused some problems because I don't know. I mean, if you're a millennial, this is like...
Yeah.
Old stuff.
And I don't mean like
Because
Dennis
I'm on the
is-
cusp. I consider myself an exennial.
Dennis is like a year and a half younger than me, so he's like
I'm a half a year younger than you.
well, is that right?
I
Well,
think so.
whatever. He's a little younger than me. I'm old. I'm old inside, everyone. So he considers himself like on the cusp of.
Well,
being
I think
a
it really comes
millennial.
down to, and I've said this before on the show. I think it's like I think the distinction between your Gen X and your millennial is your relation to the internet.
Yeah.
And I was an extremely early adopter. Like I ran a BBS, which is a bulletin board system,
Yeah.
out of my house when I was like 11.
One of my favorite games I ever played was Joust that I downloaded off a BBS.
Yeah, and for you youngsters out there, a BBS is like a forum, except that someone has to dial into it, and then they have to post their messages, and then they hang up, and then someone else dials into it and answers those
Inevitably, your
messages.
mother picks up on the same line while you're on
and
the
then like
modem.
she gets a noise in the phone. It's like, and then when that happens, a whole bunch of like weird characters you didn't even know happened on a computer appear on the screen.
It's like Cyrillic. And,
yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah. So back in my day, we used to have modems that had phones that hung in them.
Yeah. So, and that's
phones used to have lines attached to them.
And that's the funny thing, is because they made this cable modem designation in 2002. And if for those out there, modem really means modulator demodulator.
Yeah.
And what it does is it just like it says, it takes a signal and it turns it into another kind of signal.
Yeah.
That
breaks apart packets.
That's all it does.
Yep. And
in order to do dial up, you needed to use a modem, which changed the phone signal into, ones and zeros over the phone line. And then to use DSL, pretty much little bit of a different kind of modem, but the same thing, Cable modem, it changes like the signal that the cable companies.
And a lot of this has been radically simplified by the fact that our phones are all digital now. Like everything's gone digital now.
Everything's digital now. Yeah, back then analog, you had an analog modem and had to change the analog signal into ones and zeros.
My dad, who was a radio frequency engineer, like they loved them some analog because it's really cool, complex technology to manage analog. Digital, as wonderful as it is, it's basically the distinction between like somebody who
it's
really
imprecise.
likes listening. Well, yeah, like it's like somebody who likes to listen to LPs that are actually wax, like the old, as opposed to the like downloading something off iTunes.
Right. Well, I mean, a digital
sound quality is richer, but
a digital signal is really based off of. It's simulating an analog signal. I mean, that's really
exactly what it
is. So basically, they all those technologies work fundamentally the same. There's nuances in them.
There's really just conversion between
right. So to grant cable modems a different type of status
was not a good idea.
It was completely insane. And now there's some legal dancing you can do, and I to go into it is extremely boring. Yeah. But there's basically some lawyer reasoning on how they were able to kind of squeeze water from that rock to give cable modems the designation that they gave it.
I like to think this was ignorance, but I suspect it was not.
Well, it could have been ignorance, but they actually kind of found some words and we're like, yeah, these words mean this, so cable modems are different.
You want words? I got lots of words.
Cable modems are different than, phone modems and DSL modems. Yeah. You and I know they are no different. So, rightfully, folks freaked out.
Yeah.
I mean, they had this situation going where, big cable TV companies are they're treated completely different than your phone companies. And this also goes back to, getting back to the whole, tangent, getting back to, why I brought up your phone modems and dialing in is, do you remember AOL?
Yeah. I had AOL.
Do you remember Prodigy?
Yeah.
Okay. Those were like internet portals, I guess, I think those are they used to call them.
Yeah, that's exactly what they called them.
And at the time, the phone they would basically piggyback on the phone company to provide you internet access. And the phone company had to do that because they were common carrier. So they had to give their network up to
cable companies could care less.
Exactly. A company couldn't come along and say, we're going to utilize Comcast, or at the time, whatever cable company was around at the time, use their network for our internet portal, because the company owned it as an information service. And it created a huge disadvantage if you were a phone company.
Well, and let me pause you there, because this concept is going to be really important when we fast forward in time about 15 years to like current day.
Mm-hmm.
Because what that does, that structure of the market, is that the cable company portion of the internet, those of us that used the cable company side of the internet, right? We access the internet through Comcast or whoever. There was inherently going to be less innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, AOL and all of those that were carried over on the telecom side, they weren't perfect or anything, but there was all sorts of competition.
Well, that's the thing. If you remember, because that's the funny thing is, and Pi brought this up in his speech. He's always a fan of saying how net neutrality somehow inhibits innovation and competition.
Right.
When did the .com surge happen?
Right.
Happened in the early 90s.
Prior to. Yeah.
Prior to this cable modem thing. All of that like innovation and, the World Wide Web and
the actual technological innovation all happened from like 1990 to 1996.
Right. In 2002, when you had an internet service provider that wasn't common carrier, we were in the middle of a recession.
Yeah.
And, and then we had the huge crash in 2008, 6 years later.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, sure. Correlation, causation. But there's definitely no evidence whatsoever that common carrier designation hurts innovation.
Well, and
I would say, if anything, it's counter. Like the evidence would show the opposite.
Yeah, the easy way I think about it is like you can see how companies, like major companies, were investing money, right? And where there was a dogfight was on the common carrier side, where there was, sorry to put too fine a point on it, but atrophying technology was on the cable side.
Yep.
And basically all anyone did with the cable side was, cross their fingers they can get to the internet fast enough to get to Google and then go wherever they needed to do, right? Like, or go wherever they needed to go. And, so all of the neat innovations that were portals back in the day when people thought portals were neat, like Yahoo and AOL and all those, just did not exist on the cable side.
Right.
You just didn't use them.
Right. I mean, there was, at some point, it was a proxy, but you had to purchase that cable service first.
Exactly.
Like you could use the AOL client, but you had to buy the cable service. And the phone company wasn't really like that, because you would buy Prodigy, and sure, you needed a phone line to get to Prodigy,
but that was it.
Yeah, you didn't have to buy any added service to do it.
In the latter, the one where you were basically buying the extra add-on from Comcast or whoever, Charter,
right, whatever cable companies around at the time,
right, Cox, was really for those people that had gotten to where they enjoyed Yahoo or AOL,
right,
and they moved from an area where they had a regional monopoly that was a telecom monopoly to a cable monopoly.
Yeah, you know what? That might be a good show one day, is the telecom industry, or maybe like a history of the internet.
You trying to give me a stroke? like
Let us know. Email us.
Yeah.
Podcast@groundedreason.com.
Well,
do you want a history of the internet show? That would probably be like a 4-parter.
Yeah, especially since, and we talked about this. I did a lot of research on this, and there's like lore and myth.
Oh, yeah.
Around a lot of the early internet.
Oh, yeah. Well,
like there's serious debate.
There's some
about
serious debate then.
When it started.
Well, there's this whole like who invented email thing too.
Yeah.
Like it's a bunch of that. And then if you want to get into like modern times, you want to get into like the deep web.
Yo.
And
that's when you get real creepy.
Yeah. So let us know.
So if you're interested, let us know. We'll gladly take it on.
Yeah, definitely. So, as I was saying, rightfully, folks freaked out because, they're essentially, this is a monumental shift in the way we treat communications.
Yep. It was a really big deal.
And
it was getting codified again in policy.
So you have traditional phone companies that have to give up their service to, these internet portal type services and other ISPs because they're pretty much, they're the internet. They're the access to the internet. So if you have if you want to start at an ISP, you talk to one of the phone companies, their common carrier, they have to give you access. You run lines, you can run an ISP. You can't do that with a cable company because they're considered something different. Well, a company in Southern California called Brand X, oddly enough, sued the FCC because of this, because they said this designation is ridiculous, that, you're giving cable companies special treatment with the cable modem. Well, the Supreme Court, it went all the way. I don't remember when the initial case started, but in 2005, it hit the Supreme Court. And the court basically ruled that the rules at the FCC and in the Telecommunications Act of 1996 are so vague that they need to defer to the FCC, which I find, it's reasonable. The court didn't see that they had the expertise to make any decision.
Again, it's a narrow decision. That's what we expect from our court.
Exactly. So now you have a situation where not only has the FCC made this horrible designation, which anybody who has any amount of critical thinking whatsoever can see that this is a problem, where, you're giving special treatment to a device that fundamentally does the same exact thing.
It's a translation tool.
It's all it is. So anyone can see this fundamental issue here. In this day, now we can see it because we understand how all these technologies work.
It was harder then, I'll give them that.
Well, because everybody wasn't so savvy with, technology is like everybody, whether you're a techie or not, you have to deal with technology. Back in the early 2000s, it really wasn't like that.
Yeah, it was at least less so.
Right. So now we're in a situation where you have the FCC, they codified a rule, the courts have basically justified it. At least they did give the FCC the leeway of saying, you can change your mind if you want to, because they kind of just deferred to them so they can change it at a later date.
Right.
So now we're in 2005. FCC decision's been upheld. Still, you have phone companies with a lot of monetary muscle freaking out.
Yep.
So instead of kind of fixing this problem, which I'm sure at the time, because Powell's no dummy, he knew. I mean, he knew after he did this, there's an issue. Instead of fixing it, he doubles down on the problem. And he declares DSL lines and dial-up lines information services as well, and gets rid of their common carrier designation.
Which, again, I don't get the idea of stepping in a hole and then grabbing your shovel and keeping digging.
Right.
I don't get it.
Okay, so under Powell, centuries, if you want to go by the Republican playbook of using a few years as another, to
marker,
put an S on the end of it, centuries of precedent thrown out the window by Powell's FCC.
Yeah.
And then later, when wireless came in, what are you going to do? Because you've already declared every other internet service as information. So you might as well just allow data services in there as well, because you're going to run into another problem.
Yeah.
Well, immediately, because this all happened in 2005, and immediately issues started to happen. because, and when I started to, I mean, that's not the whole truth. Because in 2007, investigations from the Associated Press found that Comcast was throttling various BitTorrent services.
Sure.
Now, when you go back, do you know when they started throttling BitTorrent services?
I would guess 2002.
Well, they waited a little while, 2005.
Ah.
Which is basically when, I guess, if you're in the catbird seat, because that's kind of where they were. In 2002, they were in the catbird seat. They had special exemption.
Yep.
You don't want to rock the boat too much.
Yeah.
But once they declared, information services for all, you're like, well, hell, might as well.
Yeah.
And they started throttling. So they started throttling services they didn't like in 2005.
And again, when you're talking torrents, I mean, forgetting like the copyright issues and all that stuff for a second, but if you're talking about fundamentally what they do, they're providing content.
Yep.
Right? And
the content that they already provide.
Yeah, that Comcast, at least in all likelihood, provides, right? So you go, hey, wait a second. Now that is someone providing content over my lines as Comcast that is a competitor with my cable service.
Right. Now, granted, illegal.
Yeah.
But it's not too far a stretch of what happens later.
No.
Because they did the same exact thing to Netflix.
Right. Which is not an illegal service.
Right.
They have paid for those copyrights on that material.
All right. So in 2007, again, AT&T forced Apple to block Skype and other competing voice over IP phone services on the iPhone. The wireless provider wanted to prevent iPhone users from using any application that would allow them to make calls on such over-the-top voice services. The Google Voice app received similar treatment from carriers like AT&T when it came on the scene in 2009. So already they're taking advantage of this special information service treatment, and basically snuffing out any type of innovation, like Google Voice or Skype.
Well, again, if you're conducting anti-competitive behavior, a byproduct of that is pushing down innovation.
Right.
Because innovation requires investment, and investment is not possible without capital.
Yeah.
And the capital gets choked out by the lack of competition.
Yeah. And now, I mean, I'm just naming some big players here, but there's also
lots of small ones.
There's lots of medium-sized too that are doing this sort of thing. Like there's Madison River in North Carolina did stuff like this. TELUS, which was kind of one of the bigger players in the time. Yeah. They started blocking access to servers that hosted web sorts supporting labor strikes against the company. Whoops.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. I mean, that's freedom of speech right there.
Well, and in fact, this is actually when Dennis and I talked about net neutrality back on previous episodes, there were two aspects that we brought up. One was like competition and all of the things that come out of that. But the other was like our fundamental rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of speech.
Yep.
And this is a clear example of how that can be breached by a company, let alone the state.
Yep.
Right. So, I'm off my soapbox.
Well,
Sorry.
I mean, and Windstream's another kind of big company. In 2010, Windstream Communications, they had 1 million customers at the time, and they copped to hijacking user search queries made using the Google search bar in Firefox.
Sure.
Users thought that they had set the browser to the search engine of their choice, and they were redirected to Windstream's
custom
search engine. Right. So that's like going to Burger King, and then I don't know, McDonald's kind of owns their access and puts a fake McDonald's thing on front and steals your money. I mean, really, that's ridiculous. Yeah. It's crazy.
It is crazy. And so let me back up for a second when I was talking about our rights to freedom of assembly, right? obviously freedom of speech, like everybody gets how all of this applies to that. But freedom of assembly, like in the internet age, it's a virtual thing, right? Like so forums, Facebook groups, whatever we want to think of, but like our ability to gather together in a virtual space and discuss whatever it is we want to discuss, that is fundamentally infringed by this type of activity. And what Dennis is talking about, which is basically fraud.
Yeah.
Just the fact that
What?
it
No,
is
the fraud. Yes, it is fraud, and there's no there was at the time there was no way
right
to do anything about it.
And my point is the fact that it's virtual fraud as opposed to someone putting a false window in a drive-through is immaterial. Fraud is fraud.
Right.
In impinging on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly is impinging on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Like these things, like in this age, them happening over the internet is the same
it's exactly
as
the same.
us happening or having this happen to us in our physical reality.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just giving you some like a couple of these.
Yeah,
There's
these are cliff notes.
Exactly. Like okay, in 2011 through 2 years to 2013, AT&T, Sprint, and Verizon blocked Google Wallet, a mobile payment system, because it competed with similar service called ISIS, which all three companies had a stake in developing.
Of course.
Okay.
Right. Oh, guess what? They also provide phones via their services, right? Like they have deals worked out with Apple and Nokia and so on, and so they want certain things that, like, if they have a deal worked out with Apple, they don't want you using an Android-based wallet.
Right. So, okay. So the internet, the internet hits in ARPANET is in the 70s, but the internet hits like commercial public use mid-90s pretty hard.
Yeah. That was when I really started seeing it.
By the end of the 90s,
it was a thing.
Americans are all over the internet. Yeah. But we had a pretty peaceful existence until ISPs were given this information service designation. And then all hell breaks loose.
Right.
And they start going hog wild, blocking services that are competing with them.
Well, and again, we were in the sanguine days of non-resistance or, resistance, whatever is going on now, right? So people weren't thinking about their freedom of speech rights and things like that so much. So this is really a pocketbook play in the meantime.
Yeah, well, see, the funny thing is in 2005, before all this stuff started happening, Powell realized his mistake. And he came up with this whole open internet principles, which basically stated the no throttling, no blocking type thing, but it was really just a principle. They had no enforcement mechanism anymore because,
so
they declared them information services.
Can I put my policy wonk hat on?
Sure.
Okay, so the cardinal rule of designing a policy is do not come out with a principle or whatever you want to call it, a rule that you can't enforce.
Right, and that's essentially what they did.
That's what it is.
They knew they messed up, and they wanted a way to
Don't put speed limit signs out if you don't have cops.
Right. Well, so when in 2007, when the AP found that, the whole BitTorrent thing with Comcast, the FCC decided to try to crack down and enforce their principles.
Right.
And of course, in 2008, the court pretty much said, sorry.
Yeah, your principles don't mean a thing.
Right. You didn't do.
You got to do the heavy.
You have no leg to stand on.
Yeah, you have to put it in you have to pass a rule. Like the FCC has rulemaking authority, they have to pass a rule.
Right. I mean, and there was another BitTorrent issue that hit the courts. And again, the FCC tried to kind of step in. And the DC Circuit Court just tossed it out and said, because they basically hit them with a cease and desist order saying you have to stop throttling. And the DC Circuit Court said, sorry, you can't do that. Right. And really, it came down to, I mean, there's many, like, examples of, there's like tons of court cases that happen when all this, because people are suing one another because violations are obviously happening. Right. But the courts are just like, sorry, there's the rules. Right. This is what the rules of the FCC laid out. There's nothing really we can do about it.
This is clearly an executive branch or potentially legislative branch issue.
Well, that's what they said. They said that either the FCC needs to, define what they're going to regulate,
or Congress
and
has to do it. That, right? Like, that's the way the Constitution is.
Right. So this went on, and eventually, like, a new commissioner came in, and in 2010, Commissioner Janikowski adopted the Open Internet Order, which for the first time made net neutrality rules official when it comes to, like, FCC regulations. But unfortunately, like, that was challenged. It worked for a while because they made an official ruling, and it kind of chilled things out a bit. But in 2014, the Verizon fell into this, throttling issue as well.
Well, and it becomes, I mean, you got to think of it as internal counsel if you're one of these large firms, right? Like, how much money are you making / saving or cutting into the pocketbook of a competitor versus what are your legal fees going to be, right? Like, and that's how you do the calculation. And once it gets to the point where you think you're going to end up in the black by throttling and taking it to court, well, then that's what you do.
Exactly.
And I don't, I mean, this sounds terrible, but I can't help but say it. I don't blame the Verizons and so on of the world for doing that. That is the regulator's fault, right? Like, the FCC should have stepped in and straightened this mess out. And frankly, they should never have created it.
Right.
The rules were straightforward.
Well, and that's kind of what happened in 2014, because, like, Verizon sued the FCC over because the FCC tried to enforce its rules that it came up with in 2010, which worked for a bit because they made rules and they said these are it. But when Verizon challenged them, the court basically said, you can't have it both ways, FCC.
Yeah.
If you declared these these companies information services, you can't make rules about
and treat them
differently than other information services. Yeah. So this is when it came, like, bloody obvious that
you have to reclassify,
that they need that the classification is wrong. All these, they've had, like, a decade of problem after problem with ISPs, throttling other applications on the internet.
Yeah, everybody's suing everybody.
And eventually, Wheeler comes along under the Obama in the Obama administration and kind of set things back the way they should have been set in 2002.
Yeah.
And said, hey, obviously these are telecommunication services.
Right. They're just moving information around.
That's all they're doing. And like we said in a previous episode, if you get rid of podcasts, if you get rid of websites, if you get rid of any type of application, the internet's useless.
Yeah.
It's not moving anything.
Yeah, it would be all right, so for those of you who haven't heard us reference the late great Ted Stevens of Alaska, it would be a series of tubes with nothing going through it.
Right, just a series of empty tubes.
Right.
Because no one, that's what creates the demand on the internet.
Right.
Is the application. That's where the innovation.
You only build tubes to put stuff through it.
Because this is how the innovation works. Somebody comes up with some killer app or some killer application like Netflix, and then everybody has to get internet access to use it. So then demand increases for traffic. They have to build more capacity. Then customers will pay more for that capacity. You know what? It sounds like a free market to me.
Yeah. And in fact, I give you a great example. Do you remember what it was like? And you got to go back in the memory banks a little bit. But what it was like to try and use a search engine prior to Google.
Oh my God, it was awful.
The results you would get back were some wild, kind of fun, right? But you rarely got what it was you were looking for.
I mean, and now it's like while Google's the major search engine,
yeah,
like,
the other ones are all
Bing and Yahoo gives
they're
decent
fine.
results too.
But my point is that, like, okay, once functional search engines were available, all of a sudden the internet went wild, right? And then, fiber was being laid left and right, or, well, copper for a long time, but eventually fiber.
Yeah.
Right? Like, and so, right to your point, like, the services are distinct from that which they run on. And the more services that can go down those lines, the more lines that will be built. And that's what drives the industry.
Right. So that really, okay, Joel and I just laid out the whole.
Yeah, does that bring us to current day?
That's pretty much where the Wheeler put those rules. He finally fixed the, I mean, we're talking what, 14, 12, a 12-year gap. A 12-year gap. So for 12 years, broadband internet was misclassified.
Right.
Where that same type of communication for, a century plus.
Yep.
So
yeah, so
the argument doesn't hold water that Obama just came in and usurped tradition.
No, I mean that's an absurdity. And then on top of it is this okay, so you're resetting things back to like normal status, right? To where information can move about whatever the delivery services are and be treated equally.
Right.
You're resetting it to that. But for that 12-year gap, think about all the waste that happened in the economy.
Oh, I know.
That was litigation or hemming and hawing or lack of investment and thereby lack of innovation, all caused because of what we think of now as net neutrality not being enforced, not being in place.
Exactly.
Right. And really, net neutrality is a fancy way of us describing the status quo. Right? Like, net neutrality is the way things have been, with the exception of a blip for 12 years since 1860.
I know. And that's the funny part is like, okay, because Pi gave his speech last week, and he pretty much said that, we should give the ISPs the freedom to act freely in the market. Because they're going to because basically the whole, whatever is going to be good for their profits, it's going to be good for everyone. That old canard. Now, does he just not read the paper? Has he just not paid attention what's happened since 2005, 2002? Because there's plenty of evidence to show that if you give the ISPs this leeway, they're going to take advantage of it.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm trying to not get off, kilter here, because like this upsets me, right? Like, we're two schlubs. Well, okay, I'll speak for myself. I'm a schlub. Dennis is a bright guy. Like,
Joel's bright too. He just loves self-deprecation.
It's fun.
He's addicted to it.
But it takes very little research to just kind of lay this out in a reasonable way and go, hey, it's not rocket science. Let's just treat it like we've treated other, information services and the systems by which the services have been provided. Right. Like it's pretty straightforward. And Pi is going to, I'm not planting any flags saying this, but he is going to make this play.
Oh, yeah. He said,
We are
at the end, I think
back to the Wild West.
Well, oh, yeah. He closed with, we were going to fight this kind of thing. Now, I mean, he didn't really give any, because we said what they didn't mention, because it's been reported that he was going to basically ask the ISPs to put terms in their they're going to put terms in their privacy agreements in terms of service to not throttle and not block.
And what that comes down...
He didn't mention that in the speech, though.
Well, but even if they do that, that comes back to the nonsense of the FCC's principles.
Right.
Like, that's not enforceable.
No, it's not enforceable.
Like, the best that could do is put the ISPs in the crosshairs of the FTC for violating some sort of, like, truth and practices type,
right? Which
activity,
which
is really hard to prove.
Not only that, but they have to go through the judiciary.
Yeah,
and
it's a nightmare.
Right.
So I mean, like, just straight fuck this guy. He's terrible. And
he really
sorry. We're on episode 40.
Now we get an E.
Yeah, I've spent
explicit
months.
I said shit twice, so whatever.
Not cursing at this fucking Nimrod. And, like, I'm tired of it. Ajit Pai is a shill for the paid television, cable and telecom industries.
No, I mean, it's obvious.
It's absolutely unforgivable, in my opinion.
And his speech today, where it was kind of billed as kind of a policy speech, he didn't really give any technical details. No. Everything we reported last show is based off of kind of insider leaks and things that we've kind of found in the press. He really didn't. It was all hyperbole.
Yeah, we were a bit excited when we were talking about it earlier today about, like, reporting on his speech, but there really wasn't anything there.
No, I mean, he basically went back to the old canard that Title II is choked innovation, which we've debunked on countless episodes. Investment in broadband networks declined, which we showed was completely untrue.
Yeah,
if you just
ridiculous.
All you have to do is look at the the Wall Street filings of all the telecom and cable companies to show how much
they're
they've
doing quite fine.
No, I mean, okay, job growth too.
Yeah.
Like, I saw a report saying that since Title II. Now, I mean, sure, this could all be, correlation.
It's correlation, not causation.
But there's no evidence to what he's saying.
Yeah.
They said that 700 Comcast hired like 7,000 people since the Title II designation.
Right.
Before the the 2 years before, 1,000. So
something's up.
Something.
And all I'm saying is that in principle, the internet is not something that is owned by the ISPs.
Yeah, and
right.
Not only that, here, grasping at straws. This is great. Americans' online privacy was weakened because Title II completely stripped the FTC of its authority over broadband providers' privacy and data security practices. Oh my God.
I'm going to have to walk out.
The FCC, Wheeler's FCC, put protections in place that Congress overruled. And you know what, Chairman Pai, if you really cared about it, you could put those things in place right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's well within his authority to do. And again, like we've talked about how the FTC doesn't have the authority to do this because of, the Ninth Circuit Court?
Yeah, they ruled basically saying that any company that has any Title II service, even if the information service is in question, it doesn't matter because the FTC can't regulate a company if that company has a Title II service.
And
phone services, essentially.
And we pointed out sheesh, I think last episode, but it might have been the episode before that, hey, coincidentally, Comcast is coming out with a phone service.
Right. And then
shocker.
And this isn't just, the two of us talking on a podcast.
No.
Like, this has been reported in the press that the FTC can't really enforce anything on any company that has, regardless of whether the Title II, regardless of whether or not the service is Title II, if that company has any Title II services, the FTC has no jurisdiction.
Yeah, I remember we said this, I think it was like 10 episodes ago. I believe I said it, but it could have been either one of us, that if I was Comcast, first thing I would do is go start up a little telecom subsidiary and let it lose money. Who cares?
And, yeah, the commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission agreed with that.
Yeah.
And said that, I don't know what Pi's talking about because we really can't act on any of these companies.
Can't do anything with it. So, like, I've said it earlier, and I've been trying to avoid it, but straight up, fuck that guy.
Right. And you know what's funny is, like, we got an email saying that our last episode was the most depressing episode ever.
And what was his name? Theodore, we agree with you.
We do. And
both
now
of us walked out.
We're pissed.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I can't say it enough, man. Like, this is like, make a stink, people. Call your congressman.
Well, and Pi, I mean, because we're recording this before. We have, like, he's gonna put it out for comment on Thursday. We're recording this Wednesday evening, and it's almost Thursday morning. He's gonna put it out, later on. Well, he put it out on Thursday. I'll put instructions in the show notes on how you can go out and comment. Now, knowing how Pi is rolling through on this, comment, show to give you a backing on the Federal Register. But I think people need to go out in the street on their next meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think
which is in May. I think it's. I'll check the date. It's like May 18th or 19th is like their next meeting.
I think there's 3 things we should all do if we care about this. 1 is comment on the Federal Register. 2, call your local congressman.
Definitely call your congressman.
Because nothing scares the executive branch like Congress calling.
Right. Yeah, so get on that.
Because Congress owns the budget. Congress calls, the executive branch listens.
Yeah, this is going to take some rebel rousing because the SEC is a commission. They can pretty much, while they're supposed to look at the comments that come in and the public and judge,
skip it.
They can ignore it. They can come up. They can kind of finesse their way around that whole, because it's a rule. It's written.
You get a handful of congressmen and senators calling him directly.
Right.
He's going to think twice. And then I think the third thing is we put a good, handful of thousands of people out in the streets. People will pay attention.
Right. So that's what we need to do. I mean, really, that's where it is right now. It's
pretty serious, honestly.
So Theodore, yeah, last episode, it was probably our most depressing episode ever. And we were really sad. However, now that Chairman Pi has kind of released his plan and kind of is on the record, I think you would agree that Joel and I are back to our feisty selves. So, on that note, this is Dennis Restaro.
And this is Joel Reeves.
Take care, everyone.
That didn't sound very feisty.
No, not at all.
Take care.
Later, guys. Remember, seriously, step up, comment, call your congressman, raise a ruck.
Don't forget to subscribe.
Yeah, do that. We'll see you next time.